Well, that was weird. I could swear that my Streamlabs crashed and that an entire week has passed since we last spoke. Anyway, hello and welcome to the sixth episode of the Sweeney podcast, the Rabbit Hole podcast, with me, your host, James, from the YouTube channel Sweeney. Another terrible intro. But we also have to wait for the first 30 seconds where we need to find out if our microphone is working. Sounds like it's working on my end. We will just have to see. Last week we were talking about the practice of Balkan village burning, one of the most interesting phenomenons of the Balkans. And we were talking about how, there was this really famous poem, The Mountain Wreath, that was written by the Prince Bishop of Montenegro, which is this small country that you can probably see on the map right there, that was very much infected by this process of Serbian nationalism. And I'm just going to reread the paragraph that we read last week, just in case there's any new viewers who haven't watched that episode. It is hard to underestimate the influence of the Mountain Wreath. Today it is still celebrated as one of the pinnacles of Serbian literary achievement, but in the wake of another Balkan war, its significance of a missing link. It helps explain how the Serbian national consciousness has been molded and how its ideas of national liberation became inextricably intertwined with the act of killing your neighbor and burning his village. Powerful words that are contained within the Mountain Wreath poem. This is, in many ways, the foundational document of not just Serbian militarism and Serbian nationalism, but like Serbian ultranationalism. It's not just about like throwing off the shackles of the oppressor. It's about like retribution and rebirth and prophesied coming again and having to take direct action against those that oppressed you up until this point. This is the age of romantic nationalism. It is very much inspired by the arts and literature and poetry. It's got this like beautiful veneer. It's got this outside gorgeous, sophisticated veneer. It's one where you walk down a hallway in a museum and you look at gorgeous statues and beautiful paintings and you read amazing poetry and you listen to music. And it's all very, very romantic and beautiful. But underneath the romanticism is the dark side of nationalism. It is the exclusionary nature by which the philosophical underpinning of nationalism is by its very exclusionary. And this would come to fruition during a period of the Balkans, a period in the Balkans called the Balkan Wars. So we were talking a little bit last week about how during this national awakening period of time in the Balkans, you've got this Serbian semi-independent principality that is allowed to exist through the auspices or the purview of what is called the Ottoman Porte. And the Ottoman Porte is basically, it's like saying the White House. It's basically a symbol of, it's a symbol of the legitimate rulership, the direct middle of the empire there in Constantinople, this capital city from which the Ottomans have conquered. Now, the interesting thing about this early principality is that it achieves its independence right around, like, the building blocks of its independence sort of start around the Napoleonic Wars. So this is an incredibly disruptive time, and in many cases is the conflict that like births nationalism in and of itself. Because not only does Napoleon just, start nabbing up territory, he sort of starts to spread the ideas of the French Revolution, which in itself is probably one of the most unhelpful phrases there is, because like the revolutions that came before it, it is incredibly difficult to talk about what the revolution actually stood for. And much ink has been spilled discussing this topic. One of my favorite things is like that idea of like, what is the effect of the French Revolution? Well, it's too soon to say. I can't remember which historian said that, but it reminds me of that that quote by John Green in Crash Course, where the French Revolution like touched everything. There was nothing was sacred to the French Revolution. They would they targeted everything from like religion to secularism to classical philosophy. Everything was on the table and up for review. It was a performance review of Europe and the world and colonialism and religion and society and nationalism. It was a performance review, and the French revolutionaries thought, you know what, this needs work, and they drew a big, D- or F, and they circled it in red, and they said, see me after class. They weren't happy with the way the feudalistic society had led to this bourgeois, as they saw it, this bourgeois type European continent that needed overthrowing, and that's essentially, and it's not truly clear how much, in my opinion, like it's not truly clear how much the French Revolution would have spread were it not for all the European monarchies of the time, like directly attacking the French and the French revolutionaries and this like new French Republic that gets set up during this time. But we know what eventually ended up happening was that all of these monarchies sort of see France and the French Republic as like a threat to themselves. They try to take over, and this leads to the rise of a very talented, famous general, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he sort of, becomes this like megalomaniac who wants to bring the revolution to the rest of the continent. And who knows, if that hadn't happened, if they'd never turned on the Austrians in the first place, who knows if that would have happened. Anyway, when the French take over, they start setting up all these like little puppet kingdoms all over Europe, and they start nabbing away at little pieces and setting up their own little sphere of influence. And this has like major consequences, not only for, these old religious disputes between people, but also like law. The very foundation of law in European society at the time was sort of building on precedents and legal reformation over the course of literal centuries. And the French sort of try to do away with that as much as they can and try to build something from the ground up. Be really scientific about it. The Enlightenment and sort of this like this new absolutist enlightened philosophy that had started to spread in Europe during this time had sort of valued science over superstition and progress over tradition, that kind of thing, which is like a gross oversimplification of what the French Revolution stood for. But they tried to institute that in all the places that they could. And one of the things that happens is like they take over little pieces of the continent and they try to set up these little republics. So they start extending the franchise. Franchise just means vote. It's not about McDonald's. It is something that just means, you get a piece. That like the word franchise sort of comes from this word about like having a stake or a piece or a say in society, and that franchise is expressed through the concept of a vote, and votes are very democratic, and democracy, as practiced in the West, is very classical and Greek and it's got its roots in all these like the classics and classical philosophy, and they're sort of rediscovering that and re-embracing these kinds of things, because up until this point, democracy was very, very limited. Considered a privilege to be able to have any sort of say in government, and it was connected to these like royal families and nobility, and sometimes you would have things like parliaments coming up, and in France at the time, it was something called the Estates General, and that was like this most meager expression of what democracy is or could be. And this is a big undertaking, because suddenly you've got all these peasants working out in the fields and saying to them, "Hey, how would you like to vote in our society?" And it wasn't implemented the same way in every part of the continent. Extending the franchise happened in pieces. I don't have all the information on that, but it sort of happened in pieces, and they sort of extend the franchise first to the owning class, and then to the non-owning class, and that kind of thing. It happened over time. This is incredibly disruptive, and it sort of introduced these ideas. And one of the places that the French sort of implemented this directly, that they never got to take a hold of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, but they did get to take a small piece of it in Dalmatia. So these ideas spread pretty early on in Dalmatia, and that's obviously a part of what eventually becomes Croatia, and of course Yugoslavia eventually as well. So this is the sort of backdrop that's happening in this time. Everyone's sort of starting to think of themselves as nations. And what it means to be a nation is not exactly fully fleshed out yet, by any means. But this is also a time of war. The Serbian Principality gets itself that little bit of independence, and one of its rebel leaders is... last week we talked a little bit about Black George, and he is just... absolutely, like, he's extremely brutal. He comes from this like Hajduk tradition, this military tradition of the Hajduks. And the military frontier. All of this had sort of coalesced into this like very valiant, like brave fighting spiritual idea of what it meant to be a freedom fighter or a Hajduk in the Ottoman Empire and in the periphery of the Habsburg Empire. And all of these things were changing, and it made the Serbs feel like they needed to rebel. They needed to go against these imperial powers and set up their own state for their nation. And Karađorđe he's not the only leader of these rebels. There's another one named Obrenović. He comes from this house. The House of Obrenović is what eventually becomes his dynasty. He has Karađorđe unceremoniously assassinated, murdered in a field somewhere, I think, or like a jungle in the bushland, which is just this like crazy mob tactic kind of way that European politics was working at the time. It never ceases to amaze me just how many people are assassinated during this time. Like the 1800s and 1900s, it was like legitimately just like not safe to be a ruler of any kind of like, not even just revolutionary new states, but also the monarchists, the traditional monarchists and the bourgeois places. These are very like unsafe roles to have. People are being assassinated left, right, and center by social revolutionaries and national revolutionaries. There's all sorts of upheaval going on. He gets himself killed, and then in comes Obrenović, and Obrenović is very clever because he decides he's just going to sort of placate and do some deals to try and have himself legally recognized, and he's got a lot of friends, and he says, what I want to do is, I think he is the one that is supported him and his dynasty are supported mostly by Austria, whereas Karađorđe was supported mostly by Russia. Russia is like very worried about what's going on in Austria. They really don't like that Austria is becoming really, really powerful as the Ottoman Empire is shrinking. The Ottoman Empire is this thing that has like made Russia paranoid for the past century or so, because they're like the primary problem for Russia to be accessing the sea, they can't control the territorial waters that surround them without with the Ottoman Empire as an antagonistic force. And the same goes for the Austrians to a large extent. They're competing, and they're seeing the Ottoman Empire as this like crumbling, sick man that is downfall is sort of inevitable. And the Austrians and the Russians are very paranoid about the alternative side's influence over the Balkans. The Russians have this like big like interest in the Serbian church, and that's like their primary way of influencing politics, or not politics, but like influencing what happens in the Balkans. But the Austrians, they're far closer. It's easier for them to get there. They can get their troops a lot quicker. They're intertwined in they're the like one that they're really worried about in terms of their expansion into the Balkans, because these two are big rivals. The Austrian Habsburgs and the Russians, they're big rivals for control over the areas where they meet, and they meet primarily in Central and Eastern Europe and the Black Sea and that sort of area. That is a big problem for the Russians. So the Russians support one side, Karageorge, and the Austrians support the other side, which is Obrenović. And Obrenović knows this. He has this like advantage. He's going to say, I'm going to wait until Napoleon is defeated. Napoleon sort of marches into Russia. This is like a great game changer for Obrenović, because Napoleon is famously defeated, and then he's on his trajectory downwards. The French revolutionaries and Napoleon in general being defeated is a major boon for Serbia, because the European powers that defeat Napoleon, they get together in Austria, in Vienna, in the Congress of Vienna. They decide, what are we going to do about all this? This Napoleon has caused a big problem for us for the last however many, like more than a decade. Let's figure out what we're going to do and have things back to the way they were. Obrenović is like really clever. He sends a delegation and to negotiate what's going to happen with Serbia. They've had this rebellion. The rebellion has been put down, so they have a second rebellion. That rebellion is far more successful because they're at the negotiation table now. They've forestalled the Ottoman advance long enough that they can have an audience with all of these European leaders, chief among them the imperial power of Austria, who is their biggest backer. And they succeed in getting themselves recognized for like a semi-independent state. And during this time, there's like a clause that over time, the Principality of Serbia will become slightly more independent over time. And during that time, it's like the Ottomans have to do like certain things. So first, they have to like remove their troops, and then they have to take their garrisons out of the fortresses, and then they have to, there's all these like little boxes that they have to tick. And one of the things that becomes really a big focus for Obrenović and this early principality. Obrenović is he's like a petulant child. He just like doesn't get what he wants, and no matter what concession he gets from the Austrians or the Russians or the Ottomans, he's never happy. He's like, well, I just kind of wanted to rule my state. Like he wants to be like a medieval lord. He wants to be a medieval fief-owning, estate-owning person, and he wants all the peasants to work for him. And the problem is that all of these like people in the early state building process, they're like, no, that's not what romantic nationalism is about. We're supposed to be setting up a successor state that is inspired by all these nationalist reforms. We're supposed to have a parliament. We're supposed to have checks and balances. We're supposed to have an independent judiciary. And so he's being like forced into a corner like a little baby, and he's crying and saying, "Oh, this sucks. I don't want to be a revolutionary leader anymore." This is essentially my very, very inaccurate description of Obrenović and what bothered him. And Obranović is he's not the only independent Serb ruler at the time. Of course, there is also Montenegro, who has also gained international recognition for its independence and has grown quite a bit in size. So I think if I have, so as you can see here, so this is a little bit further back. This is during like Karageorge's rebellion. Montenegro is down there in the light blue. It has gotten significantly bigger during its rebellion, and they've managed to extend the borders. So now you've got like two competing dynasties, both trying to like claim legitimacy, but there's this like implicit agreement, like subtextual agreement between the two, that their goal is to eventually unite these two together. You've got the Montenegrin dynasty on one side and the Serbian dynasty on the other, and both of these are like looking to this romantic idea of the past and seeing themselves as the successors of these like this like semi-mythical Serbian empire. And that is something that is the context in which that like the Mountain Wreath poem comes to be, because the area especially where Montenegro is and the territory that they take over is filled with Muslims. It is filled with Serbian or Serbo-vernacular speaking Muslims. These are not like Turkish speaking Turks. They're not like Albanian speaking. There are Albanians and Turks and other ethnicities, and there are Catholic minorities and that kind of thing. But the people that give them a real headache, the people that give the Montenegrins a real headache is their neighbors. It is their next door neighbors, people in the neighboring villages who speak Serbian. I'm just going to call it Serbian for simplicity. And who are Muslims, and they this troubles them because they're like, why would you convert to Islam if you're a Serb? And this is one of those hilarious things where they call everybody who's a Muslim a Turk. You know, they're like, well, you're a Turk, but it's okay because you can come back to the light. And the problem is, if you don't come back to the light, we're gonna just burn down your village. And that is the context that sort of precedes this nation-building state of Serbia. Remember, village burning is by now this like incredibly practiced thing. So it's an altogether normal for them to do this. It would be weird if they didn't, from their perspective. They're thinking to themselves, well, our village is going to be burnt down if the enemy is in power, and if the enemy is not in power, well, our village is, we better go to burn down their village during the rebellion. During the rebellion, like you're constantly worried about your village, no matter who you are. You're thinking to yourself, I can't get insurance. This is terrible. I live in a village burning prone area, and that was one of the clauses that was in my insurance contract. Housing insurance needs reform badly. I live in Serbia or Montenegro, and I can't insure my house against village burning because it just happens all the dang time. So this is like this because nationalism is this idea of you have to conform to a certain set of ideas. You have to conform to a certain checklist of what makes you a Serb, and this is something that like is incredibly difficult for these early sort of nationalist intellectuals to grapple with, because they can't agree on what makes a Serb. Is a Serb your language? Is it your religion? Is it your ethnicity? Like, what is it? Is it just this like self-identification? Or what is it? And people are disagreeing wildly. Especially in like Dubrovnik, there's a lot of in what is Dalmatia. There's an intellectual circle there that is embracing identifying as a Serb, but still, being a Catholic. That's a big problem. There are Serbs who identify as Serbs and who are Muslim. That's a big problem. There are a bunch of Serbs in Croatia in the military frontier. that's a problem, because they're saying, well, this is Croatia. We live in Croatia, and they're singing songs about Croatia, but they're Serbs and they're Orthodox Christians. Big problem. And not to mention the fact that the Serbs didn't just like dominate all the lands that they called Serbia. There were Romanians, there were Bulgarians, there were Albanians, there were Turks, there were Jews, there were even Armenians at one point. It was a multi-ethnic empire of which they formed, they formed majorities in certain sections of it, but not all of it. So as this early principality is achieving more and more independence, and they've got a magnifying glass on them, and they're trying to write a constitution, and they keep failing to write a constitution because one of the other powers, like the Austrians or the Ottomans or the Russians, they're all fighting with each other over what Serbia is gonna be. Serbia is just like struggling to form a constitution. They're struggling to figure out what the role of their government will be, what powers they will have, and who will be able to live there, who's going to get the franchise, who's going to be able to vote. These are all major problems, and the Serbs can't just work. Even if the Serbs were just left to their own devices, this would not be an easy task. This would be incredibly difficult because of the aforementioned disagreement on what all these things are, and they are not just left to their own devices. They are meddled with like crazy by the Ottoman Porte, the Russian the Russian imperial powers, the Russian Church, and the Catholic Church, and the Habsburgs. And the Habsburgs in and of themselves aren't like all agreeing on what to do with the Serbs, because they have another entire constituent part of their empire called the Hungarian crown, the Hungarian parts of their kingdom, who have been like rebelling on and off against the Austrians themselves for a really long time. They were the thorn in the side of the Austrian Empire, as well as being like its partner in crime. They were incredibly divided on what to do, and they're constantly meddling in this little border principality that is slowly becoming more and more independent over time. And one of this is incredibly frustrating, and it's what causes this political turmoil. Before this had happened, this part of this like romantic movement was called like the Illyrian movement. That's like Illyria is like that ancient homeland name for this part of the world, the Balkans, what we would consider Yugoslavia. The romantic name for it is Illyria, in the same way that like a romantic name for Britain is Britannia or Albion or something like that. And that's like primarily, especially like Croatian intellectuals like to refer to their national experiment, and then that eventually becomes subsumed by the idea of Yugoslavism. So within the nationalist movements of each of these parts of the world, not only is there like rivals who are like pro-nationalist and anti-nationalist, there are nationalists who are rivaling with each other. In Croatia, you have Croatian nationalists on one hand and Yugoslav nationalists on the other, and that sort of spreads to the Serbian parts of the lands. You got like the hardcore Serb nationalists, and then you've got the Yugoslav Serb nationalists that think that we're all part of a greater whole. Or what exactly is that whole? Because clearly there's differences between us, right? Like we have small cultural differences. We have differences in geography and differences in climate. There's like differences to be acknowledged, and there's differences to be ignored. This is all complicated, and you're probably understanding now why it takes me so damn long to make a video. Anyway, the Illyrian movement is this early movement of all these people, and they're sort of trying to decide what is going to be their future when the Ottoman Empire eventually collapses. A lot of those intellectuals see the rebirth of Serbia as this like flashpoint, the semi-independent Serbian kingdom as this flashpoint that they can migrate to. And one of the resources I was reading was talking about how some of these the people in the Illyrian movement, so like primarily like Serbs and Croats, didn't even really speak Serbian or Croatian or Serbo-Croatian anymore. They'd been separated for so long from their culture and their history that they really struggled with it. So a lot of them decide, well, the Serbian kingdom has been rebirthed, and also Montenegro. Let's migrate back to our ancestral homeland. They still have connections with their church, and that's like one of their primary and their poetry and literature, and that's their like primary way of interacting with their culture and their history. And they decide, well, they're gonna like hire tutors, and those tutors are gonna teach their kids how to like read and write in Serbo-Croatian again. And this is like a massive flashpoint in the rebuilding of Serbia as this like experiment, a modern nation state on the bones of the sacred dynasty, the skeletal remains of the once great Serbian empire that had once existed on this soil in the valleys of the great Morava River and the Sava and the Danube and the fields of Kosovo and Montenegro. The bones of this former state, let there be a palingenesis, let there be a rebirth, and they're all going to teach their kids how to read and write Serbo-Croatian again because they forgot. So that is this cultural movement that is happening. And because the Serbian Principality and Montenegro Principality are so unstable politically, this sours a lot of their enthusiasm. This is like really like, oh, this is so hard. I've moved over. I've crossed the Danube. I've reversed Moses. We've undone our Serb migration, and we're migrating back to the homeland. But everything's just so damn unstable over here, and we just can't seem to get everything right. The Austrians are meddling, the Russians are meddling, the Ottomans are meddling, and we just can't get anything right. This is really difficult for them to deal with. And so a lot of them leave. A lot of them say, screw this. I'm going back. I'm going back to Hungary. I'm going back to Austria. I'm going back to the military frontiers. And I'm going to go try and renew my efforts for nationalist independence over there instead. Because, of course, there were tons of parts of the empire that still had major South Slav majorities. So they're like, well, let's, instead of abandoning our plans to try and win independence within the empire, let's go back. Let's try that again. Because clearly the Serbian Principality ain't nothing going right over here. This is too damn difficult to do it over here. It's a very unstable place. So all these intellectuals, all of these people migrate back north. Well, a lot of them do, and they try and they get swept up in the springtime of nations, the 1848 revolutions, and they try and establish some sort of nationalist state, constituent states within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the most famous example of this is the Triune Kingdom, or trialism, and Yugoslavism and Illyrianism sort of falls out of favor, especially in Croatia, and they decide we're going to try trialism. And trialism is this like idea of, instead of just like an Austrian and a Hungarian part of the empire, why don't we have an Austrian and a Hungarian and a Slavic part of the empire? 3 parts of a greater whole, which is still very hilarious because it doesn't solve the problem. The Austrian Empire has something like 10 different ethnicities or something, like 10 different major ethnicities with populations in the millions, presumably. I don't know. So if the South Slavs get their way and they achieve a trialistic kingdom, a trialistic empire, then all the other ethnicities are just going to want their own kingdoms. And you're going to want the Romanians are going to want their own kingdom, and the Poles are going to want their own, and the Czechs and the Slovaks and blah, 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 blah. So this is like something that the Austrian Empire is resisting like crazy. They're super not into that idea, but eventually the 1848 revolutions come along. which is another big nationalist revolution that happens all over the continent. And they lose a lot of ground to the Hungarians, and they sort of make a compromise with the Hungarians and say, we'll make a bifurcated kingdom. We'll make an Austro-Hungarian empire. No longer will it be one empire in one ruling dynasty. We're now going to have two kingdoms within one empire, both linked by one dynasty. If that sounds incredibly confusing to you, don't worry, me too. This is sort of the backdrop of what happens in the Balkan Wars. This is the really late sort of part of these nation building activities is the construction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this map is from the 20th century. So before Serbia and Montenegro had expanded this much, you've got the Austro-Hungarian Empire that is split into these two constituent parts, and one of them is the Austrian part, the old Habsburg part, and the other is the Hungarian part in orange. And it's sort of unimportant about that right now, but the Slavs sort of end up losing this. The South Slavs end up having to be part of the Hungarian half of this empire, which is a tremendous loss for them. So they've had their enthusiasm re-sparked. They've moved back to Serbia, and then Serbia is just sort of a shit show. So they move back to the Austrian Empire, and the problem is they lose there too. This is incredibly disappointing for them. They're just like, no matter where we go, we can't seem to get this right. What is going on? And they start to realize, oh, the problem is imperialism. The problem is the people we've been kowtowing to for the past few centuries actually don't really care about us. They don't really give a shit about us or our independence or anything like that. They're sort of just using us to further their imperialist goals, said the South Slavs to one another during the Austro-Hungarian compromise. They realize, dang, we've had to spill a lot of our own blood just to further these imperial powers that ultimately did not have our back. And that becomes a problem as the Ottoman Empire keeps shrinking, and the big problem for them is this part of the this part of the Ottoman Empire that is like a real sticking point. This like part between the two worlds. So back here, this like triangle part up here is Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is this like, you can tell it's like in a very precarious position there, right? You've got the orange part at the top, that's the Austrians, and you've got the red part down at the bottom, that's the Ottomans. And Bosnia is the sort of like no man's land in between that is still ruled by the Ottomans. And the Austrians eventually end up like trying to take that over. And they're like, oh no, not only did we fail to get what we wanted, but now the Austrians are taking more South Slav land. Oh, isn't this a big problem? This is all what precedes the Balkan Wars and the First World War. It is this like nationalist expression. So like this is chaos. This is like absolute chaos. The nothing is going right for them. What does start going right for them is that the only thing really going right for them though is the Ottoman Empire shrinking. The Ottoman Empire is just too weak to stand up against the Russians and the Austrians and all of these little independent principalities and kingdoms that are sort of forming in the wake of their collapse. The Montenegrins managed to expand their territory a little bit more, but of course, mostly the Serbs, the Serbian kingdom that eventually get recognized as a kingdom because they just achieve so much victory on the battlefield. They march south and they take over what is today Kosovo and North Macedonia. As you can see, that sort of southern part of that blue section there. This is like their first like real victory in a long time. Not just like politically or militarily, but like psychologically. This has a massive effect on the Serbs. They're achieving a victory on the battlefield, crushing the Turks, and they get to work doing what they do best: burning down villages. These are old, very old, antiquated parts of what they see as their part of their territory, and they start burning things down. During the expansions of the Balkan Wars, the Balkan Wars is like where village burning is like its most practiced. It is its most sophisticated. There's an art to it. There's like a regimented, sequential, very like cold-hearted approach to burning villages. It's like, you, Tim, you go down that road down there, and you burn down that village, and you, Jonathan, you go down that road there, and you burn down that village, and we'll send all these people southward, and we'll sing patriotic songs as we march, and we'll wave patriotic flags, Serbian flags, and we'll celebrate. And when it comes up to the Battle of Kosovo anniversary, we'll have a big parade, and we'll all celebrate. This like embrace and celebration of ethnic cleansing is so potent in the Balkans during this time. It is trying to achieve an ethno-state. And the problem is that all of these Balkan kingdoms, these Balkan states that arise as the Ottoman Empire collapses, they're only really cooperating with one another temporarily, because they have competing nationalist aims. That part of North Macedonia, down at the bottom of Serbia, that is like very culturally and linguistically linked to Bulgaria at the time, and still is today. There is far more mutual intelligibility between the dialects of the Slavic languages spoken in North Macedonia and Bulgaria than there is with Serbian. But the Serbian intellectuals and all these like historiographers, they're saying, no, these are just old Serbs. These are Serbs that have lived there since before the collapse of the Serbian Empire. We're just going back and taking what's ours. This is the historic capital of Dušan's empire. I think Dušan was even like, he was crowned in Skopje, which is like the capital of North Macedonia. And they're viewing this as like very integral parts of their state. This is like Serbia, and they deliberately erase all these names associated with either the Ottomans or the Greeks or the Bulgarians or the Albanians. They deliberately erase all those names, and they call it South Serbia or Old Serbia. So we've got Old Serbia and New Serbia. And all their literature and their maps and the stuff that they printed at this time is all just calls this place Old Serbia. And they decide we're gonna go burning of villages down there, and we're gonna make the people part of our nation. And there's these overlapping claims, and of course there's a lot of Greeks that live there. They come to blow with the Greeks. The Albanians, they come to blow with the Albanians. There's Muslims and Turks of various different kinds. This is an incredibly bloody process. You don't just march into a territory and take it over. You have competing, overlapping claims, and this very famously breaks out, or infamously I should say, breaks out into the Second Balkan War. As the First Balkan War is just settling down, the Bulgarians get quite angry because they've realized that they've been duped, and their allies have actually been colluding with each other behind their back. So the Greeks and the Serbs got together before the First Balkan War, and they said, we're gonna take Macedonia. We're gonna take Macedonia and split it between ourselves, because we don't want the Bulgarians to have it. And the Bulgarians realize this as the war ends. They go, what the hell? Guys, I thought we were friends. Why did you take this part that is very culturally contiguous with Bulgaria? Why did you take over this piece that I wanted? I wanted Macedonia. I wanted North Macedonia really, really, really badly, and you guys took it. So, they felt hard done by. So it's perhaps no surprise that they rose up and took arms to their former allies, the Greeks and the Serbs and the Romanians, because there were overlapping territorial claims there as well. and they go to war with Bulgaria, and Bulgaria's like, oh damn, because the Ottomans get involved. So everybody's gotten together and risen up against the Ottomans, and then the Ottomans join in with everybody else as they rise up against the Bulgarians, which I think is just one of those like lovely twists of fate that is just would be a lot funnier if it didn't lead to so much like heartache and loss later on and during the time. Obviously, it is just an incredible twist of ironic fate, and one of the things that makes nationalism to me just so laughable and silly, because these are just lines on a map, and it mattered so incredibly much to these people who are leading these states at the time. And the Greeks and the Serbs eventually come out on top in the Second Balkan War, and they start ethnically cleansing the parts of the territory that they took over. This is where, like I said before, where ethnic cleansing and the village burning really becomes the systematic thing, and it's incredibly sad. And on this map over here, you can sort of see this is the lead up to the First World War. And during the First World War, Serbia is overrun. It puts up a good fight, but it's eventually overrun, and it has to do this harrowing retreat through the Albanian mountains, and gets the government in exile, gets rescued, and they get taken into exile. And the troops get planted in various places, but most famously in the Macedonian front in southern Greece. And eventually the Serbs are on the winning side of the First World War. And as the Ottoman Empire is sort of collapsing, like properly collapsing this time, and there's this like Turkish revolution happening to create their own nation state, the Macedonian front collapses, so you have like the Germans and the Austrians on one side, sort of to the north, occupying Serbia, and the Bulgarians obviously. They're doing horrific atrocities, trying to ethnically cleanse or pacify Serbia in any way they can, and the troops eventually get the upper hand because they're on the Allies' side, and the Allies get the upper hand in the overall war, and they sort of move from the south up to the north, taking back Serbia. That's sort of where you get to the political situation at the end of the First World War. This is the culmination of a very lengthy and politically fraught war. You got Serbia in blue, Montenegro in green, and you've got this the Vojvodina, or I can't remember exactly what it was called at the time. Maybe it was Banat, but it was this like semi like self-declared independent state in the Banat parts of Hungary, inhabited mainly by Serbs. And then in yellow you have Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Dalmatia, and all that kind of area. They sort of, the yellow parts decide they're going to get together and they're going to collectively negotiate. So one of the things that they do is they say, we're independent, and for our first act of independence, as the Austrian Empire is collapsing at the end of World War I, they're collapsing, and they say, for our first act of independence, we would like to delegate ourselves with the power to negotiate on behalf of ourselves. Which, I wish I was joking. That's exactly what they said. That they granted themselves the power to decide what to do with the land that they're on. And they're really worried about Italy. So Italy's over there, a short distance away, and Italy was on the side of the Allies, and Italy was promised a lot. They were promised a lot of Dalmatia, which is all those little islands off the coast of the yellow bit of Croatia, and it's inhabited by a lot of like Romance-speaking people that had settled there during the time of Venetian dominance over the area. And these Romance speakers, which I think they're called like Dalmaticani or Dalmatiki or something like that. It basically means just like Dalmatian, but they speak like a dialect that is quite closely, they speak a Romance dialect that is quite closely related to Venetian, and the Italians are very much seeing this as part of their territorial acquisition. Again, very hilarious how all of these territorial ambitions overlap with one another. They're all claiming bits of their own land. It's almost like that there's no real national defined boundaries, and that most of them are kind of made up, I would say. It's almost like that's the case, but it seems a lesson that is a lot harder for us as humans to learn. And they're really, the Croatians and the Slovenes, they're especially worried about Italy, because Italy looks like they're about to come and take all of Dalmatia. So they turn to the only person nearby, the only people nearby who have a army in the area, an intact army, which is essentially the Serbs of Serbia and Montenegro. And the Serbs, they're battle-hardened soldiers. They've been fighting on the front of Macedonia, and they've retaken all this land. They've fought for their freedom. They've had to march through the mountains. It's all been like incredibly battle-hardened. But it's been a rough few years, let's say. And during this like interwar period, after the First World War, this is incredibly a difficult and tumultuous time, because nobody really knows what's going to happen. This yellow part, sort of, their original plan was like, oh, maybe we'll just like form part of this like federated state of Central Europe in the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Maybe we'll go back to our old plan of trialism, but instead of trialism, it'll be dectalism, 10 different ethnicities in the empire. Maybe we'll try something like that. And they eventually realize that's not going to work, because as they're declaring independence, they reduce their capacity to fight quite a lot. They're losing a lot of their imperial arms and armory. That a lot of that stuff has been evacuated, and in a lot of their peace negotiations, they have to hand over their guns and that kind of thing. And what little they have, they're sort of playing their cards close to the chest. They don't want to overtly tell everybody how much guns they have, and because prior to this, they'd been part of the Austrian Empire. They were armed and armored by the Austrian Empire. All the money and finance and logistics and that kind of thing, this all belonged to the Austrians, the Habsburgs. So they're at a significant disadvantage, and all their capital is gone, and nobody knows how to finance anything anymore. They're looking like they're about to get gobbled up by the Italians or whomever. So cleverly, these people who granted themselves the powers to negotiate on behalf of themselves say to the Serbs, "Hey, can we join you? Can you protect us?" And they were working off of this, like these older, these Illyrian intellectuals and politicians and stuff, that sort of these court deputies, all these people that used to run the Austro-Hungarian Empire that were South Slavs. They'd gotten together, and as the war was taking place, and they said, we're going to have this like sort of preliminary goal of uniting us all together. So they say, hey, do you remember that deal we had during the war? Maybe let's resurrect that and brush the dust off and see what we can do. So they get together around the negotiating table, and the Serbs basically get everybody else, especially the Croats, to fold like a deck of cards. They get pretty much everything they want right off the bat, because they're the ones with the guns. They got the guns. They can fight. They're battle hardened. They've marched through the mountains of Albania. They've suffered disease outbreaks. They've fought in the trenches of Macedonia. They're going to get what they want. And this is part of an incredibly this is part of their own national what do you call it, like paranoia that had infiltrated the Croats at the time. The Croats, and to a lesser extent the Slovenes, so these are Catholics. They don't want to be ruled by like this Orthodox Serb dominated kingdom, because they know that the territory that they rule is dominated by Serbs as well. This is one of those things that is sort of forgotten about the early construction of Yugoslavia. So the political map looks a lot like this, but this is what the ethnic map starts to look like in the way that they described ethnicity themselves. Ethnicity by this point, and nationalism and national expression, is starting to look a lot like what we recognize it today. A lot of that is born in the late 19th and early 20th century during these horrific wars. This is a patchwork. This is essentially what you're seeing is the result of centuries of migration. The Serbs are the blue section, the dark blue section. They're dominating all of these areas, not just the territorial part of the core Serb kingdom, but also giant chunks of Bosnia, giant chunks of Herzegovina, and giant chunks of Croatia. They, if this would be a Serb-dominated kingdom, if this would be a Serb-dominated Yugoslav joining together, it's not hard to see that the Serbs are the majority. And the Serbs have been practicing this like village burning thing for a few centuries and ethnic cleansing, and they're trying to like overtly build a state, and they've like invalidated the idea of different like competing Illyrian movements and different Yugoslav ideas. This is the faction that won out in this pursuit of the Serbian kingdom before the First World War broke out, was the faction that was very militaristic and wanted to produce a greater Serbia. This was this idea, this like Yugoslavism to the Serbian nationalists meant greater Serbia in a lot of those circles in power. Obviously, not to everyone, and that's primarily where the big conflicts were happening politically between these two competing forms of nationalism. But basically, the idea was that this represented a huge threat to the Croats and the Slovenes and other ethnic groups, which we'll talk about later. This is like it represents an intense paranoia for them, because they know if we agree to join this without any caveats, we're essentially putting ourselves at a huge disadvantage. We make up something like, I think it was like 20% of the population. I can't exactly remember, but they're making up a minority of this kingdom, and the Serbs make up more than half of the population at the time. The Serbs also have the old Serbs that they're counting towards that, so it's hard to really determine how much of this Yugoslav kingdom that they would make up, because they're counting people like Bulgarians and Macedonians as Serbs. So in their mind, that old part of Serbia, which is down there in green, that is just to them. Those are just Serbs. They're not Macedonians. They're not Bulgarians. Those are just Serbs. And then, of course, the other really sticky point is the little sort of maroon, or I can't remember what color I've used there, but that sort of color down there, that's Kosovo, and that's also been primarily settled by a huge population of Albanians. And this is... They're counting these people as just Serbs, you know. These are just corrupted Serbs, and they count towards our domination. And this early Yugoslav kingdom, it really only recognized like 3 ethnic groups. It recognized like indigenous ethnic groups. This is the compromise that they came to: Serbs, Slovenes, and Croats. And that's the compromise that they agreed to when they formed Yugoslavia. So people called it Yugoslavia informally, but it was like the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, or Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. I can't remember. They switch it around a couple of times because they're indecisive. But the idea is like we have to agree that this is like a multi-ethnic state, which is, again, this is just trialism again. This is just... instead of like a Austrian and a Hungarian and a South Slavic kingdom, now we just have a Slovene, Croat, and Serb kingdom. But they're not the only ones. They're not the only 3 that make up this kingdom, but they're the only 3 that matter, because together they would form like the bulk of the population. You know, but before the Croats and their Croatian like nation building project had really taken off, Dalmatians viewed themselves as very different. Istrians viewed themselves as very different. The Slovenes weren't that united. They would come from like competing parts of Slovenia. Like one was very like Pannonian and flat. The other one was mountainous and hilly and that kind of thing. And there were differences in culture. That's not even to mention the Muslims that live in sort of like Novi Pazar and Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina. These are claimed by both sides, the Serbs and the Croats. They're like, no, that's just a corrupted Serb. No, that's just a corrupted Croat. This is all just terribly confusing. Absolutely nothing has been solved. They've had wars. They've had like 2 Balkan wars. They've had a restored principality before that. Then they fought an entire world war, which a Serb started, and yet nothing is sorted. Absolutely nothing is going right. They've had victory in the battlefield only. That's it. There has been no political sorting out of these problems, and there's been no ethnic or religious sorting out of these problems. They've fought tooth and nail to basically have a set of borders that is internationally recognized, and that's about it. So is it really so surprising that this practice of Balkan village burning would rear its head up again in the future? Because you've got the Serbs and the Slovenes and the Croats, who are the only ones who are being legally recognized, and everybody else is sort of like an alien resident. Hungarians, Germans, Jews, Albanians, Bulgarians, all these other people. These like not being extended the franchise. They're not being extended national recognition in the same way. And this, of course, means that eventually that village burning is going to rear its head. Most famously, or infamously again, I should say, during the interwar, not the interwar period, but during the Second World War, where Yugoslavia gets taken over by the Axis powers, and an indigenous, a local fascist movement is co-opted and is tragically takes over the part of Croatia and becomes this like fascist puppet state, where like all hell breaks loose and ethnic cleansing and that sort of thing that escalates even further. And whereas the Serbs had primarily directed most of their efforts in the previous century towards the Muslims, we talked a bit last week about what it meant to be a Serb was like in opposition to being a Muslim at the time. They're primarily directing it against these people whom they called Turks, and they're really aiming their nation building project at those people. That starts to change because their conflict in those like ethnic cleansing kind of way is aimed at the Muslims, like I said. But their political adversaries start to become the Croats. The Croats, and to a lesser extent, the Slovenes, that's the new, like, enemy that the Serbs start to identify within their political nation-building project. And, a lot of it is self-inflicted. The Serbs, like, went to great lengths. The Serb nationalists, when in Yugoslavia, went to great lengths to try and, like, dominate the kingdom. They didn't want to sort of build this brotherhood. They wanted to create a greater Serbia. They wanted to secretly subsume the influence that they themselves and their church would have over the kingdom, and slowly eradicate the influence of the Catholic Church, and eradicate the influence of the Croats and the Slovenes. Not as much the Slovenes, mostly the Croats, because there was this like Serbo-Croatian dialect continuum, which basically all means that they all spoke variations of the same language. And every time the Serbs would try to turn up the dial of centralization of the kingdom and try to politically and economically dominate the kingdom, the biggest people to resist that were the Croats. So suddenly, as the Second World War comes in, and the weak Croatian, like this weak, vulnerable part of the Croatian state that is like this thorn in the side of the Serbian nation-building project, these two people who'd come together to try and build a nation together and say, let's create a South Slav, a Yugoslav state, they were incredibly vulnerable to infiltration by fascists. When fascists come in, they have to have fertile soil in which to propagate. And Croatian nationalists have just been downtrodden, and they haven't achieved what they needed or what they wanted. They've been lied to and subsumed, and their power has been slowly stripped away. And eventually, Croatian nationalists sort of become the dominant political force within Croatia itself. Obviously, when I say nationalists, we're talking different brands of nationalism, right? We're talking about different factions of nationalists within Croatia itself. So when the territorial divisions happen and then democratic elections start happening, there's so much political violence between the Serbs and the Croats that the Croats start to embrace like overtly not just like separatist, not quite separatist, but like overtly like independence focused political nationalist parties. They're voting for them in the parliament. There's like the Croatian Peasants Party, I think it's called. The Croatian Peasants Party is like very much like this like nationalist expression for to protect the rights of the Croats in Yugoslavia. The Croats were like a persecuted ethnic minority within Yugoslavia. We need to protect ourselves. So they start voting for the Croatian Peasants Party. And the Croatian Peasants Party like achieve a lot of their aims. They want to create an independent Banovina, which just means like an independent, semi-autonomous part of Yugoslavia. And essentially they're trying trialism again. they're going back to old habits and trying trialism. And this eventually they sort of start to win this independence, and one of their leaders, Stjepan Radic, is killed by a Montenegrin Serb on the floor of the Yugoslav parliament. It is absolute chaos. The king comes in, the Serb king comes in and says, "That's it, no more parliaments," and he institutes a royal dictatorship to try and manage the violence, and he's in crisis mode. For the Croats, they're looking back and they're like, okay, this is just, we started to win ourselves a little bit of independence, a little bit of recognition, and yet we're still being dominated by this Serb monarch. Because, yeah, it's their monarch too, it's their king too, but it's a Serb king. You know, they're like, for them, every time the Serbs try to do something, they're seeing the ulterior motive of the Serbs trying to dominate the kingdom. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong to a large extent. The king does want to operate in good faith a little bit with the Croats, and he sort of does. And he grants them that Banovina sort of towards the end of the interwar period. But it's too little too late, because the Croatian Peasants Party and the Croats in general have been quite thoroughly infiltrated by fascists. And these fascists have the protection, first of all, from fascist Italy under Mussolini, who'd harbored a lot of these fascists. So, like a lot of the ultranationalists and things like that. When the dictatorship took over, when the king took over the dictatorship of Yugoslavia, a lot of these fascists fled to fascist Italy and sought refuge. And Mussolini had been politically harboring them for a long time. So when he'd been protecting them and they sort of made their way back, they thoroughly infiltrated the Croatian establishment in the establishment of this Banovina, and boom, World War II begins because of other reasons. And nothing good has happened in Yugoslavia. Politically, it's terrible, right? Because of the aforementioned things. But not only is it politically unstable, it's like poor economically. Nobody's willing to give them any money. No banks are willing to lend to them. They're struggling. The financial market has collapsed due to the Great Depression, or vice versa, and things are just going bad for them. They can't invest in industry. They can't invest in themselves. They can't build an army. They can't centralize their authority because they got no money. And the little bit of money they have, they're getting from the Germans and the Italians. So not only are they like being infiltrated by fascists, but they're being economically subsumed within the fascist sphere of influence in the rise of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And that's the context in which World War II begins. And that is the context in which the unimaginable horrors of the Second World War unfold in Yugoslavia. Village burning has by no means ended. It eventually becomes this thing where instead of focusing on like the Turk ethnic slur, which is just like a slur for Albanians or Muslims of any kind, it eventually becomes this like huge dispute between the Croats and the Serbs that eventually breaks out into all-out conflict in the Yugoslav wars of the late 80s, 90s, that sort of time. And that's in essence where the story mostly ends, um, in terms of the practice of Balkan village burning. But it's one of those things where you do wonder if war was to break out there again, would that practice continue? And certainly wonder these things. It's like, is it like an integral part of the history of this region, or is it something that can be well and truly buried in the past? Now, I don't really know, and that there's sort of the I guess the sort of portent or the warning that I'd like to illustrate in the video, and I wonder where this kind of thinking and mentality really gets you, because if history is like any indicator, nothing good. It doesn't take you anywhere good. It is only the fuel for heartache and that sort of thing. This was a less fun episode. This wasn't as good as the other episodes in terms of fun. It's weird how like ethnic cleansing and genocide just kind of tends to be a bummer. It's just weird. Like I really thought this episode would be a bit more fun, but alas, we had to talk about like ethnic cleansing and genocide. That is just one of those things that comes up when you study history. It's not all fun. It's not all rainbows and sunshine. Sometimes people are burning down villages. Last week we didn't get to questions, but I did have one that was DM'd to me from a patron. Where are you? Okay, so Betha Ray asks. So I'm trying to remember if this is. So this will be like 2 episodes ago at this point. So this might not be relevant to what we're talking about today. So Betha Ray, thank you for your question. Betha Ray, thank you for supporting the channel on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/Suibhne, Suibhne. That is the primary place where you can be able to make a donation, or if like you can do a one-time donation, or you could sign up and support the channel. And you can also get a bonus episode of this podcast up there as well. So the other way you can do it is to go to the main channel and become a YouTube member. Sorry, my thoughts are all over the place. There is, if you do that and you ask a question, you'll get like priority for your questions to be answered on the podcast. If you like to do that, just like the patrons and the YouTube members, you can do that as well. If you want to follow, you can follow me on Blue Sky. All the links will be down below. So Betha Ray asks, what existed before the Magyars? Was it like you say, quote, the bones of the state, or was there no continuity with the Serb kingdom at all? So if I understand your question correctly, yes, there was continuity, but like not. I don't know exactly what kind of continuity that would have. The problem with that, the historic record that talks a bit about this time period, is that you have so much of it is just destroyed, and there's major works of like chronicles that are done. This is like the early Middle Ages or the Middle Ages. The chronicles, or these like compilations of records. So like every now and again you'd get like somebody going out into wherever records are kept, like in castles and monasteries and that kind of thing, and they try to gather as much information as they can. This is very expensive, so it's done rarely, and they'll compile everything. They'll compile stories, they'll compile songs, that kind of thing, and they'll try and put these records all together. And the problem is that a lot of those records, like if you've got like this one master record, all those like little records, they survive less. So not only has like stuff been just like destroyed by war and famine and plague and that kind of thing, where these monasteries fall out of fashion and they're being taken over by the Magyars, and they're being brought into ruin and that kind of thing. So there's like physical records that just like decay or burn or whatever. Now those bits that did survive, just like we have like even less of that, or like fragmentary versions of that. And the bit that does survive is like the big codifications, the big chronicles and the annals and that kind of thing, where people have tried to preserve these things, but you lose something in the process, obviously, because you can't like get all the information in one go. This is the problem with studying history. so that like early Serb polity, like we call it a Serb polity, it's like a South Slav polity. That early polity, yes, it does have some continuity with the Serb kingdom that came afterwards, because the people are still there. There's a lot of continuity in the institutions and the cities. They're still ruled by the Byzantines come in and they take back over these territories again, and they install local rulers again, that kind of thing. So it's not like this thorough destruction of the state. It's not like everyone is sort of wiped out in one foul swoop. There's still a continuity of peoples and linguistics and that sort of thing. I hope I've understood your question correctly. It's sort of hard for me to really know what you mean by like the especially when I talked about it so long ago now. If I have not, I will address it again next week. So hopefully next week we're gonna move on. We'll talk about something new, and this will form a good bit of supplementary a little bit of supplementary content for the main video, which is coming out very soon, he says. What would be terrible is that I really hope that this one doesn't crash as well. I hope it doesn't cut me off